As of the start of Season 11, there are over 150 champions now present in League of Legends, and the game has had a long history of releasing new champions with new and innovative designs while retrofitting old ones to stay relevant as things evolve and change. Riot definitely doesn't pull any punches when it comes to their designs. They take risks and venture into uncharted territories, trying different mechanics and different playstyles in order to keep things fresh and unique. And during the first decade of the game's lifespan, we've been able to see that Adventure's design philosophy grow more and more brazen over time. I would say it began roughly around the start of Season 4 with the releases of Yasuo, Gnar, and Azir, where they made a conscious effort to create new champions that diverged from the status quo. Ever since then, the standard with almost every champion is to apply a concept that is unique only to them and them alone. For example, when you hear Rek'Sai, you think of her tunnels. When you think of Alawi, you think of tentacles. When you hear Taliyah, you think lots and lots of rocks. Zoe's about bubbles, Sylas is about ultimates, Viego impersonates champions, things like that. Each of these champions is well defined by a very conspicuous gimmick. Having a gimmick for every character was still present in the past, such as Nocturne being about darkness or Heimerdinger's turrets, but they were more subtle back then. Naturally, with progress comes contention, as Riot has been loosening their constraints with new releases, and some of them have been met with increased backlash, specifically the ones that have been a source of frustration to play against. These champions got to a point where an entire meme was started to point blame and ridicule the champion design and champion balance teams for their supposed immaculate and infinite wisdom.
The skill, but he might! Affiliate! How many years?
But in all seriousness though, while I share my own grievances towards these champions, I also think it's a little too unfair for us to give them such a hard time. Consistently designing champions well gets exponentially more difficult the longer a game lives on for because, as you know, things change. People's expectations change. What they consider fun and interesting back then is not the same as it is now. I made a video a few months back talking about the issue behind Riot's recent champion releases with the stance that they seem to be, at least in my opinion, gradually forgetting their own design philosophies that led them to the success that they have today. And I still stand by the main point of that video, although looking back I definitely was a lot more short-sighted on my reasoning. All the same, it's understandable why they have to release champions that seem more and more extraordinary, obnoxious, and everything in between. Many League veterans who've been around since the good old days of Season 4 or earlier talk about how it was such a blessed time, and that's when League of Legends was at its peak. I may not be able to exactly relate to them since I began in late Season 5, but I can wholeheartedly assure you that nostalgia is the rosiest rose-colored glasses to ever exist, especially in video games. After all, this sort of sentiment exists in other platforms and other titles that have lasted past 5 years. Everyone talks about how Minecraft was so much better back in the days of 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, etc. Everyone wants to go back to the old days of pre-Big Bang MapleStory because the game was better and less crazy than it is now. Everyone remembers when the Pokemon franchise only had the original 150, or when Blue Eyes White Dragon was still the strongest monster card in Yu-Gi-Oh!, when Super Smash Bros. Didn't have 20 Fire Emblem characters. I could go on and on about the mentality of missing the good old days, but the honest answer is that the only reason those days were so good is because there were no standards back then. Despite the outrageous amounts of frustrating mechanics nowadays, like how everyone has a dash, everyone has a stealth, everyone can go untargetable and things like that, old League of Legends was an even bigger nightmare. I've only heard tales of the horrors of Evelynn who can stun instantly when appearing, or Talon who silenced AP Master Yi, or how Corki's Q was an AoE blind when Twisted Fate's ultimate was a global ability and also his Q or something. And then there was Nocturne's ult, which was global. The amount of problems we deal with now don't even come close to how bad things were back then. If you bring a lot of those game states to the present day era, they would get boring or horrible to deal with very fast. Imagine playing League of Legends where every champion had point-and-click abilities or every AD carry was just a copy-paste with a few minor tweaks. For the most part, they needed to make new champions that have weird gimmicky effects because that keeps the game interesting and fresh. It's what makes you come back to the game and keeps you on your toes. And it's a good thing that they've been able to figure out how to make that work considering there's only 3 basic abilities, an ultimate and a passive for each champion. That's all in part of Riot's changing design philosophy. Sure, it may not be the same philosophy back then, but League of Legends isn't the same as it was back then. I share the same thoughts and feelings with other players that certain champions could honestly be better off just not having ever existed in the first place, but credit where credit is due. Some of these new champions are amazing and have shown us that it's possible to create a character who can have a multi-dimensional and dynamic playstyle without needing to resort to exploitative or annoying mechanics that feel unfair to play against. When it comes to champion design in League of Legends, that's the #1 rule for evaluation, at least in terms of gameplay. do not base a champion released in Season 10 with a criteria for Season 2 because those two periods of time were vastly different in terms of items, runes, the actual Summoner's Rift, and player perception. Yes, I myself am guilty of this from time to time as I would compare the likeness of someone such as Aphelios with an old school ADC like Ezreal, but in fairness, it is important to reference empirical data and the game's history whenever delivering a new one because you want to ensure that there is some semblance of congruity between old and new. For the most part, I would say Riot does a passable job at that, as most of their champions, barring balance changes, are conceptually similar in their strengths and limitations. Hard as it may be to believe, Samira and Kalista, two new AD carries, don't have an average performance range much higher than that of Sivir and Ashe, no matter how much more the former two can do compared to the latter two. The same does hold true for super gimmicky champions like Sylas and our most recent release Viego, who can steal ultimates or basic abilities respectively. At a glance, it may seem kind of ridiculous for a champion to be able to copycat every other champion in the game, but in most circumstances, the pressure floor and ceiling for Viego is more or less the same as any of the original 40 champions, with a few exceptions. So objectively speaking, even though a lot of these new champions look super overpowered, there's only so much that they can do in a game due to the foundational confines of League of Legends. Now that we've established to suspend any personal bias against a certain group of champion, we can talk more about the meat of the video. Almost every game that employs character selection creates a series of classes and subclasses. For example, Pokemon demonstrates this through the various types: fire, water, grass, electric, ice, dragon, steel, psychic, what have you. Whenever designing a new Pokemon, that is the first thing you figure out before anything else, right? I mean, sure, you can design a dragon-looking Pokemon, but then later deem it to be a fire and flying type like Charizard, but I have a feeling they knew it would be a fire type long before they knew it would look like a dragon. In another game like Final Fantasy XIV, they employ the traditional holy trinity of classes: tank, healer, and DPS, which is then divided into subclasses or jobs: paladin, warrior, dragoon, summoner, white mage, scholar, things like that. Every time you create a new character, that is the first thing you choose. In League of Legends, all champions are divided into a format consisting of 7 classes, which you can see on screen right now. And aside from specialists and marksmen, the other 5 roles have subclasses to further divide those champions into more specific dichotomies. It's in these categories that all 154 champions so far are assigned to, with some of them having a primary and secondary role. For example, you can have someone like Jhin, who is a marksman but can double as a catcher, or Rengar, who can be built to insta-kill a squishy target or be a scrappy bruiser who dives into teamfights and brawls it out. By establishing what class they fit into, it gives the players an impression of what to expect when playing that champion. Every person who plays video games has a personal resonance with the characters they play. That's why some people like to play mages, some people like to play tanks, and others like to play assassins. It's an extension of your identity. Very rarely do you find someone who's really aggressive and brash pick someone like Janna or Soraka who are more passive champions. They would prefer to want to play someone like Pantheon or Set. Designating the new character subclass provides you with the constraints and expectations you have to consider when creating their gameplay. Let's assume you decide to make a Juggernaut. What are they known for? The wiki page does a good job highlighting the strengths and weaknesses of every subclass. Anyone who's been playing the game for a while knows that all of the champions on that list are known for having equal parts resilience and damage, while sharing a common weakness of having a somewhat hard time sticking to targets because many of them lack immediate gap closers. They're also all melee champions. Another subclass we can look at are assassins, who are known to be fast and have extremely high front-loaded damage, generally being hard to catch due to their slippery nature. However, carelessness can lead them to being neutralized rather quickly as they have little defense to their name, and often protect themselves by avoiding damage rather than facing it head-on like a Juggernaut would. Why this matters so much is that it acts as both a natural source of inspiration for creating a champion, while setting bounds for the designer to not cross so as not to create a champion that can be too overloaded. Although as I said, sometimes a few do slip through the cracks. You can't account for everyone though, after all there's no way you can make over 100 characters without a few bad apples popping up. Designing the champion's abilities is where things get less black and white, as when you think of an assassin you think of high burst damage. How that burst damage is inflicted can come in a variety of ways. Evelynn is all about sneaking up to you without you being able to see her, and when you finally can, it's usually too late. Katarina relies on her blinding speed to dance around a fight and get out as quickly as she gets in, while Akali relies on dipping in and out of stealth to gradually chip you down before going in for the kill. However you decide to approach this, so long as you stay within the boundaries you choose, you can do pretty much anything you want. And in most cases, elements of gameplay are not mutually exclusive. It's not like only assassins can have stealth or only tanks can have crowd control. But where issues arise is when those lines in the sand are breached a little too far, which gives birth to the 200 years meme where a champion can be a tank, DPS, mage, assassin, hypercarry, marksman who can seemingly do everything. I want to clarify that it's perfectly fine to make a few concessions here and there, since designing someone like a marksman who can go into stealth can once again lead to more intricate and multi-dimensional champions, such as Twitch. But every subclass has their own strengths and weaknesses, just like how every type in Pokemon is super effective against certain types and not very effective against others. And it's also why you can only have a maximum of 2 types on a Pokemon at any point in time, because if you were to have a Pokemon with 3 or more types, it could lead to a scenario where one type's weakness is covered by the others and vice versa. By giving one champion too many components of different subclasses, that can decrease the amount of options for counterplay. Counterplay's definition is the ability to stop or mitigate a threat, such as using Poppy's Steadfast Presence to shut down champions with dashes, or Yasuo's Wind Wall to halt enemy projectiles. League is all about moves and counter moves. The best way to counter assassin-type champions is to restrict their movement, since that's all they have for survival. The best way to counter a bruiser is to kite them down, since they tend to have low range and slow movement. Creating an assassin who can face tank a lot of hits, or a bruiser who has a ton of dashes or long-ranged attacks, completely removes an option that can be used to deal with that champion. It's almost like playing a game of rock, paper, scissors, except paper beats rock but ties with scissors, meaning selecting paper is almost always the best course of action since it's the safest, having no weaknesses. Balanced nightmares are often labeled as such because the more things they can do, the less options other players can take to stop them. To deal with this, those champions have to be cripplingly nerfed to artificially open up those weaknesses again. But it then forms a dynamic where a champion becomes too weak to the point where even a player's own skill cannot make up for it in rare occasions, which hurts their agency. Recently I talked about Kalista, who's a hallmark example of a balanced nightmare. Though her design is certainly quite unique, she completely goes against the natural constraints of an AD carry. Marksmen are defined as champions with great range and sustained damage, but struggle with mobility as most AD carries in the game are slow and they usually lack burst damage. However, Kalista essentially had all of them. She has good sustained damage, she has range, but she also circumvented an AD carry's 2 biggest weaknesses because she could strafe in between each auto attack, giving her mobility the likes of which no other ADC before her could even come close to, and she also had a burst element to her kit because all she needed was a couple spears on you to rip you apart with her rend. This made her so powerful that she has to be kept permanently weak, otherwise she would straight up be the best marksman in the game. Most recently, Samira is another example. She has amazing mobility thanks to Wild Rush because it completely resets on takedowns, and her rushdown playstyle gave way to a marksman with AoE burst damage. This became such a problem that just this past week, that burst damage was pretty much completely stripped from her and her mobility had to be severely restricted to not be that much different from a standard ADC dash like Lucian's Relentless Pursuit. Those are just 2 examples of what might happen when a champion's design overextends its range of coverage. Again, it is okay to go beyond the status quo and try something different. It's what brought so many amazing champions to League of Legends that would never have existed if we didn't think outside the box. Some of the best champion designs I've seen during my time playing this game have been a lot of the new ones. Jhin has none of the consistent DPS that you would expect from a range AD carry, yet still plays and feels like a marksman with the same weaknesses, only he has a different set of strengths. Rel has a really cool mechanic of going from mounted to dismounted while having the unique ability to drag enemy champions towards her like a magnet. She operates in a way no other tank support could before her, but still has the same strengths and weaknesses of her kin. Vars' design is a good example. No other champion has an AoE Zhonya's Hourglass or the ability to create a tunnel through walls. And despite his short stubby legs, he's surprisingly quite mobile. But like the other catchers, he suffers from not having as much crowd control as a tank support or as much utility as an enchanter. So he doesn't feel so oppressive to go against because while he does have some different and clever new tricks that you have to watch out for, he sacrifices the general tools other catchers would have, like shields or secondary crowd control. These champions are, in my opinion, the definition of good champion design. All 3 of them were able to push the extent of their subclasses without breaking the mold, allowing a healthy and gradual pace of evolution for a game as old as League of Legends. Of course, in every bag of apples there are good and bad ones, but I think it's important to remember that just because something is new or different doesn't mean it's bad or power creeping the game. We give Riot a really hard time for always releasing super overpowered champions, but in reality, there are way more good designs than there are bad ones. I for one thoroughly enjoy many of the new releases, and it's not fair to say someone is badly designed just because their numbers are way too high. Someone like Set had to be nerfed a few times before he reached an acceptable level, but his kit overall has very clear strengths and clear weaknesses, which is why he's one of the more better designed champions in the game. That wraps up for today's video. I just wanted to make sure I talked about other topics besides why no one plays, since admittedly I've been getting a little too comfortable mass producing them. So if this video isn't as well edited or scripted as my others, it's mostly because I'm just trying to experiment with different topics. But I hope it was interesting to listen to at least. It's still amazing to me how Riot can continue to find new champions to make despite having only a passive Q, W, E, and ultimate. And even though the community will never let them forget 200 years, I still think it's important to give them credit where credit is due. But what are your thoughts? I'd love to hear what you have to say about champion design, whether you agree or disagree with my points. I think it can definitely lead to some healthy discussion in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, a rating would be much appreciated, and if you'd like to see more content like this, please be sure to subscribe. Also check out the video description down below for links to my Discord and social medias, as well as a playlist with other discussion videos like this one. But for now, that's going to be it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next video. Take care.